In the second week of March, 1783, a folded sheet of paper began to pass from hand to hand through a cold army camp on the west bank of the Hudson. It carried no signature, it named no author, and it carried the most dangerous idea of the American Revolution, that the army which had just won the war should turn, at last, upon the country it had made. The fighting with Britain was all but over. What began that week was a different kind of battle, a test of whether the young republic could survive its own soldiers.
If your determination be in any proportion to your wrongs, carry your appeal from the justice to the fears of government. Change the milk and water style of your last memorial. Assume a bolder tone, and suspect the man who would advise to more moderation and longer forbearance. A fellow soldier, Newburgh, in March of 1783.
The Newburgh Conspiracy. The days the Continental Army came within a single meeting of turning its guns on the Congress of the United States. To understand how it came to this, begin with a promise and a winter. By the close of 1782, the fighting was finished in all but name. Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown a year before. In Paris, the diplomats were already drafting the peace. The Continental Army had settled into winter quarters at the new Windsor cantonment near Newburgh on the Hudson. Thousands of men in log huts, idle, waiting for a peace that would send them home. They had won, and they had not been paid. The arithmetic of their grievance was brutal. Officers were owed years of back pay. The men held certificates for wages that arrived, when they arrived at all, in a currency so worthless that a phrase had entered the language, not worth a continental. And over it all hung the pension. In 1780, to keep its officers from resigning, Congress had promised them half pay for life. Now, with peace at hand, every officer in the camp understood one chilling fact. The moment the army disbanded, it would lose the only leverage it had, and the promise might vanish with it.
We have borne all that men can bear. Our property is expended, our private resources are at an end, and our friends are wearied out and disgusted with our incessant applications. The officers of the Army, in their memorial to Congress, December 1782.
This is the heart of the story, and it must be felt before anything else. The anger was just. These were not mutineers by temperament. They were career soldiers who had given the best years of their lives to the Revolution, and who now watched the politicians they had fought for debate whether to pay them at all. In December, they sent a delegation to Congress with their grievances and a compromise: commute the lifetime pension into a single sum and let us go home whole. Then they waited. Through the winter, no answer came. But Congress had not answered because Congress, in the most literal sense, could not. Under the Articles of Confederation, the government of the United States had no power to tax. It could only ask. Money came in through requisitions on the 13 states, polite requests that the states, jealous of their own sovereignty, routinely ignored. Between 1781 and 1787, Congress asked the states for $10 million. It received about $1.5 million. There had been a way out, and it had failed. A national impost, a 5% duty on imports, set aside to pay the war debt, needed the consent of every state to pass. 12 agreed. Rhode Island alone refused, and a single small state killed the finances of the whole nation. Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance, kept the government alive on his own credit and borrowed French gold, and told Congress plainly that he could not advance the army a single month's pay while the treasury stood empty. So reframe the villain. It was not cowardice or malice that starved the army. It was a broken machine, a government built too weak to keep its own promises. And in Philadelphia, A group of men had begun to see in the Army's fury an opportunity. They were the nationalists, Alexander Hamilton, Robert and Gouverneur Morris, and their allies, who believed the Confederation had to be given real power, the power to tax, or the Union would not survive. The unpaid army was the strongest argument they had. The only question was how far to use it.
The claims of the Army, urged with moderation, but with firmness, may operate on those weak minds which are influenced by their apprehensions more than by their judgments. So far a useful turn may be given to them. Alexander Hamilton to General Washington, February 1783.
Washington read that letter and grew wary. He agreed the Army's cause was just. He agreed the Union needed strength. But he saw, more clearly than the clever men in Philadelphia, what they were proposing to play with. To use the Army as a lever against Congress was to hand a loaded weapon to desperate men and trust them to fire it only for show. Later, he would name the danger exactly.
The Army is a dangerous instrument to play with, to be made use of as mere puppets to establish continental funds. The suffering of a complaining army on one hand, and the inability of Congress on the other, are the forebodings of evil. I am George Washington, writing to Alexander Hamilton. April 1783.
On about the 10th of March, 1783, the wariness became a crisis. 2 anonymous papers appeared in the camp. The first called the officers to an unauthorized meeting the next day. The second, a small masterpiece of agitation, written, it is now believed, by Major John Armstrong Jr., a young aide to General Horatio Gates, put into burning prose everything the officers were afraid to say. It told them their patience had been mistaken for weakness, and it told them to threaten.
In any political event, the Army has its alternative. If peace, that nothing shall separate you from your arms but death. If war, that you will retire to some unsettled country, and mock when their fear cometh on. And to the man who would still go quietly home, go, starve, and be forgotten. The First Newburgh Address, March 1783.
Read it closely, and notice what it does not quite say. It never orders a march on Congress. It never names a plot. Its power is in its ambiguity, an appeal to wounded honor wrapped around a threat with no stated object. If the war went on, abandon the country. If peace came, refuse to lay down your arms until you were paid. Either way, the Army would stop asking and start demanding. And historians have argued ever since about how close those words came to a real intent to seize the government, or whether they were only the fury of proud, betrayed men with nowhere left to send it. Washington moved within hours, and he moved with genius. His general orders of the 11th of March publicly branded the anonymous meeting disorderly and irregular, and then, in the same breath, granted the officers what they wanted, a proper, sanctioned assembly. 4 days later, on the 15th, with the senior officer present to preside. It was a masterstroke. He denied the conspirators their secret meeting, seized the moral high ground, and bought 4 days for tempers to cool, all while appearing to give way. There was one more turn of the screw. A second anonymous address followed, cleverer than the first, and read Washington's order as proof that the commander himself now favored their cause, folding his enormous prestige into their movement. The meeting would be chaired by General Gates, the man some believed stood at the very center of the discontent, and the officers, gathering on the 15th, had every reason to expect that the commander-in-chief would stay away. They were wrong. At noon on the 15th of March, the officers crowded into the largest building in the camp, a long log hall the men had named, with a soldier's dark humor, the Temple of Virtue. Gates took the chair. And then a side door opened, and George Washington walked in and asked the general's leave to speak. The surprise alone was disarming. He drew a written address from his coat and began, not with a command, but with an appeal.
By an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline. I am George Washington, the 15th of March, 1783.
He did not dismiss their grievances. He shared them and said so. But he turned the full weight of his authority against the anonymous author's design. He walked the officers through the two roads that pamphlet had offered them: to desert the country in the extremity of her distress, or to turn their arms against it. And he named that choice for what it was, something so shocking that humanity itself revolted at the idea. Then he warned them where such a road would end.
Express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. George Washington, to the officers of the Army, March 1783.
It was a fine speech. It was not by itself enough, and Washington seemed to know it, for the faces before him were still hard. So he reached for a letter from a congressman, a piece of evidence that Congress meant to do them justice, and began to read it aloud. And then he stopped. He fumbled in his coat and drew out a pair of spectacles that almost none of his officers had ever seen him wear. What happened next was set down by a young officer in the room, Major Samuel Shaw.
His Excellency, after reading the first paragraph, made a short pause, took out his spectacles, and begged the indulgence of his audience while he put them on, observing at the same time that he had grown gray in their service, and now found himself growing blind. Major Samuel Shaw, eyewitness, March 1783.
It was a small human thing, an old soldier, tired and half blind, reaching for his glasses. But it undid in an instant everything the anonymous pamphlet had built. Here was the man who had given more than any of them, asking only for their patience. The hard faces broke. Shaw wrote down what he saw.
There was something so natural, so unaffected in this appeal as rendered it superior to the most studied oratory. It forced its way to the heart, and you might see sensibility moisten every eye. Major Samuel Shaw, from his journal, March 1783.
Washington finished the letter, folded it, and left the hall without another word. He did not need one. The spell held. With Gates still nominally in the chair, the officers voted, not for rebellion, but for loyalty. They thanked their commander, declared their unshaken confidence in Congress, and rejected the anonymous appeals with disdain. The crisis that had gathered for months was over in under an hour, not because it had been impossible, but because one man had given proud, wronged soldiers an honorable way to step back from the edge. Word of the meeting reached Philadelphia, and Congress moved with sudden speed. Within a week, on the 22nd of March, it commuted the officers' half pay for life into 5 years of full pay, in money or interest-bearing securities. The central grievance had, at last, an answer. But it settled only the form of the debt, not the funding, and the money still depended on the same impost that had already died once, and would die again. And so the deeper wound never fully closed. As the Treaty of Paris confirmed the peace that autumn, the army was furloughed and sent home. Most of the men still owed their pay, carrying certificates that many would sell to speculators for a fraction of their worth. The officers had stood down in March. The resentment did not vanish. It only scattered and traveled home with them. 3 months later, it came back with muskets. In June of 1783, some 80 soldiers of the Pennsylvania line, unpaid and out of patience, marched on Philadelphia and surrounded the State House, the very building where Congress sat. This was the rank-and-file's version of Newburgh, and it had no Washington to defuse it. The soldiers jeered at the windows and leveled their muskets, while inside, the government of the United States sat trapped by its own army.
The soldiers remained in their position, individuals only occasionally uttering offensive words and wantonly pointing their muskets to the windows of the Hall of Congress. James Madison, in his notes of the debates, June 1783.
When Congress begged the state of Pennsylvania to call out its militia to protect the national legislature, Pennsylvania refused. And so the Congress of the United States did the only thing it could. It fled, abandoning Philadelphia in the night for the safety of Princeton, New Jersey. The government had been chased from its own capital by soldiers it could not pay and could not command. No image of the Confederation's weakness was ever plainer than that flight. There is one last scene, and it is the answer to all the rest. In December of 1783, with the war formally ended, George Washington rode to Annapolis, where Congress was sitting, and did the thing no victorious general of his age was expected to do. He gave the power back. Standing before the Congress that had failed his army, he resigned his commission and returned to private life. The man who could have been king, who had just faced down the one army that might have made him one, went home to Mount Vernon. So what, in the end, had it been? On this, the historians have never agreed, and an honest telling does not pretend they have. In 1970, Richard Kohn called it what its reputation still remembers, a near-coup, deliberately stoked by nationalists around Gates, that Washington narrowly headed off. Others answered that the danger was inflated by hindsight, that the officers, in the words of the historian David Head, were not on the brink of rebellion, but wanted results through the political process. Between those poles lies the truth we can actually defend, inflammatory words and real fear, but no proven plan to seize the state. And yet the crisis left a mark far larger than itself. Newburgh and the mutiny that followed it had shown the nationalists something they would never let the country forget, that the Confederation could not pay its army, could not fund its debts, and could not even defend its own hall from unpaid men. Washington drew the lesson himself that June, in a circular letter to all 13 states, setting out what the Union would need if it were to survive at all.
There are 4 things essential to the well-being, I may even venture to say, to the existence of the United States as an independent power. An indissoluble union of the states under one federal head, a sacred regard to public justice, and the adoption of a proper peace establishment. George Washington, in his circular to the states, June 1783.
The road from that letter ran through the failures of the Confederation to Annapolis and then to Philadelphia in 1787, and the Constitution, a government at last, with the power to tax, to borrow, to raise and pay an army, and to govern a capital of its own. Newburgh did not write the Constitution, but it helped write the case for one. And then the country quietly forgot it, because nothing exploded, because the historians could not agree what it was, because the tidy image of Washington resigning made a cleaner story, and because its real lesson was uncomfortable, that the victorious army, with a just cause, had once looked hard at turning on the government it had built. That is why the story is worth remembering, precisely because it was almost lost. The hardest test of the American Revolution was not the winning of the war. It was the surviving of the victory. The moment the men who had made a nation, betrayed and armed and owed, chose to obey the fragile government that had failed them, rather than rule it. It turned on a just anger, a dangerous letter, and an old soldier reaching for his spectacles. The log walls of the Temple of Virtue are long gone, but the precedent set inside them has held for more than 200 years. The soldiers of the Republic submitting to its citizens. This has been Ember and Ash, Forgotten American History.